Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
In the intricate world of ethics and compliance, each second is precious, and slow case closures are more than just delays, they're missed opportunities. Enter Ethico. Our solution revolutionizes case management, cutting closure times in half and turning every challenge into a chance for improvement. Imagine a workspace where efficiency and compliance coexist harmoniously. Don't just dream of faster resolutions, make it your reality. Visit ethico.com/CPN today to book a demo and dive into our exclusive white paper by Tom Fox, the ROI of compliance, and to try our free ROI calculator. Empower your team with the tools they deserve.
10 for 10 for the week ending April 20, 2024. Our first story comes to us from ABC News, who reports that Senator Bob Menendez, who is charged with bribery and corruption as a sitting U.S. Senator, looks like he may throw his wife under the bus and blame her as he stands trial next month on political corruption charges. He has asked and received separate trials for he and his wife, and his defense attorneys say Menendez could take the stand in his own defense and implicate his wife by suggesting she kept information from him and he was unaware of her illegal activities. Certainly a creative defense to have when you throw your wife under the bus. Next up, from the Financial Times, in the Opinions Cybersecurity section by columnist Gillian Tett, she talks about how companies must rethink how they handle cyber risks. Recently, a company, Change Healthcare, was hit with a massive cyber attack after reportedly paying out $22 million in ransom. United Health reported a $872 million first quarter hit from a cyber attack and warned that this could increase to $1.6 billion. These are just sort of the tip of the icebergs in what companies are now facing. And so they may need to rethink their defense is, how they pay, and more importantly, how they report all of this going forward. This is certainly something that the SEC has taken great interest in. And it will be it has caused alarm because of three particular issues. Hacks have surged since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Criminal ransomware gangs are increasingly targeted poorly protected corporate vendors, and the Chinese are increasing their attacks on the United States. Next up, from the New York Times, a very disheartening story about how Binance's compliance officer ended up in jail in Nigeria. Tigran Gambaryan, an American compliance officer, went for a meeting in Nigeria and a business trip, and he and his colleague were arrested and put under house arrest. His colleague managed to escape and is now out of Nigeria, but Gambaryan has been held and now is even more closely watched, as you might guess. So wherever you want to be, under house arrest or in jail in Nigeria is not one of those places. Next up, from ESPN, which reports that Jonte Porter has been banned for life for gambling allegations. There are two general allegations against him. One is that he bet on NBA games, but second, that he revealed information about his own health to a known sports bettor, and that led sports bettors to place unders on his participation in games, which they cleaned up on. This shows the problems with the increase in publicly available gambling, and something that sports leagues are going to have to look at much more closely. Next up from the Wall Street Journal, first of several stories from the Journal, as yet another group of Boeing whistleblowers has come forward saying that they tried to raise concerns about safety issues in the manufacturing of Boeing jets and were marginalized, and indeed culture was so toxic that they were basically told that they had to stop bringing these safety concerns forward, even though they had great concern that the Boeing jets they were part of the manufacturing process on were not safe to fly. So more trouble for Boeing. Our next story today comes to us from Barron's, who reports that Nigeria has recovered some $27 million in a corruption probe. This was an investigation involving a suspended government minister and other officials. The money was found in various locations in Nigeria and outside, and so we had Nigeria actually recovering money. Next up, the first of a couple of stories from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal. The first one is Richard Vandeford reporting that the U.S. has asked the EU to take on greater responsibility and a greater role in fighting forced labor from China, particularly in China's Xinjiang regime, with the obviously based on the U.S. law of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There's been diplomatic efforts to combat Chinese state-sponsored forced labor and strengthen international coordination against this type of egregious violation of human rights. The second story from the Risk and Compliance Journal comes to us from Dylan Tokar, who reports that the Justice Department has rolled out its whistleblower incentive program, and it will give immunity to executives and lower-level employees who provide information about corporate misconduct that they themselves may have been involved in. The promise of immunity for tipsters is a part of this pilot program that the DOJ will have going forward to see what it might think about having financial incentives for whistleblowers, similar to what the SEC have. The new pilot program started and became effective on April 15th, and there's no time frame for the ending of this program, so the DOJ will evaluate it going forward. Next up, from Reuters, a article on a U.S. Supreme Court decision which said that shareholders cannot sue companies for fraud if they flout a rule requiring disclosure of trends expected to affect their bottom lines unless the omission makes another statement misleading. In a 9-0 decision, the court handed a victory to Marcari Infrastructure on a proposed shareholder class action accusing the company of failing to disclose that its revenues were vulnerable to an international phase-out of high-sulfur fuel. And the justices reversed this decision by the New York trial court and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Justice Sotomayor wrote that while anti-fraud provisions of the Securities Act of 1933 clearly prohibit companies from telling misleading half-truths, it does not apply when a company remains silent. And our final story this week comes to us from Bloomberg, which reports that Venezuela is getting serious about the corruption in PDVSA and has arrested more executives for accepting bribes and hurting the national oil company of Venezuela. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, this month's sponsor for the entire Compliance Podcast Network is Ethico. Have you ever wondered how to show the ROI of your compliance program? Have you struggled with the budgeting process, getting the funds you want for your compliance program? Well, I've partnered with Ethico to put together a white paper on the ROI of compliance, which shows you not only how to demonstrate ROI, but also how to speak finance when you're sitting across from the CFO with your budget proposals. check out the website and get the white paper. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.